very pleased to announce that Chris Owen will be presenting our webinar today, PAM 101, about the cloud. And Chris joined Centrify in 2019 as the Director of Product Management, and I'm going to let him tell you a little bit more about himself. And thank you, Chris. Take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Katie, and good morning and good afternoon to those who are watching from different time zones around the world. So a little bit about me, I've been, I guess to start with the basics, the British accent. So born and bred in the UK. I started working with privileged access management tools in 2001. So I worked across the UK government and military space, delivering PAM technologies, and delivered a wide varied kind of vendor landscape. In reality, the world was a lot different back then to what it was now, but have had a very lucky, very fortunate career. Have got to work with some great kind of technology vendors, whether it be DMZ, Quest, CA, CyberArk, BeyondTrust. And about 10 years ago, I moved into vendor world. So I started vendor world life at Quest Technologies as they were then, and had a great time with Quest. Moved into Dell when they got acquired, and then for a while I headed up the architecture practice at CyberArk in the UK, and then more recently at BeyondTrust, heading up the solutions engineering team across EMEA and APAC. And as Katie mentioned, I joined Centrify. It's coming up to 2 years, it'll be soon. So it's been a fantastic journey here so far. Really pleased in the progress that we're making as an organization. And really, I believed in something different. And we'll explain a little bit more around what that means. But really what we wanted to do today was to give you a bit of an insight into how the world of privilege is changing and how cloud is really driving that transition that we're seeing in the marketplace, and some of the key things to watch out for, as you yourselves embark on this journey. So if we look a little bit around the adoption of cloud, and specifically multi-cloud, as this is one of the biggest shifts that we are seeing within the cloud space at the moment. Now, as we're painfully aware, emerging technologies are really reshaping our world, and a good example of this is cloud technologies. Organizations like yourselves are increasingly moving workloads to the cloud, and this is really to achieve a few things: generally greater agility, flexibility, and certainly cost savings. If we look at the average spend on cloud, it's estimated to grow from 2020, it's around 50 billion to around 74 billion through 2022. And that's a figure that kind of Gartner are putting on it from an industry point of view. And a lot of people describe this trend as digital transformation. And that's simply to rethink old operating models, to experiment more, to become more agile in your ability to kind of respond to customers and rivals, from a competitive point of view with new modern technologies. And simply digital transformation is imperative for businesses, of all sizes, whether it be small, medium, or large enterprise. But extending your technology stack and storing an endless amount of data leads not only to complexity, but also challenges across your business organization. Now, some of the interesting kind of, I guess, stats around cloud, as organizations embrace cloud technologies, we're definitely seeing a rise in the number of organizations who are adopting multi-cloud strategies rather than looking at a single vendor. It's obviously risen greatly this year because of the global pandemic that we're all obviously going through at the moment. And many organizations have really moved to this remote working model, a lot of the time being forced into that type of model by various government regulations around the world. And the interesting thing about this transition, it's certainly forcing some to transition in a hurry. And obviously, many organizations haven't quite had the time that they want to be able to plan and secure their environments. From a statistics point of view, there's a lot of work, whether it be through Gartner, Forrester, et cetera, to look at the cloud transition, the cloud model. The key thing for me here is really through 2020, 95% of infrastructure as a service failures will be the customer's fault. And that is a really scary statistic. Hopefully it's not Gartner saying, everybody is messing up, because we all know as humans mistakes happen, right? And it doesn't take, a bad person to make a mistake. It takes a human being to make a mistake. But the key thing for us, as a privileged access management vendor is, throughout those faults, more than half are going to be attributed to inadequate management of privileged identities, access, etc. That's really a key thing in the market. Now, one of the biggest inhibitors, of cloud transformation is ultimately shared security concerns. And when we look at, are they justified? Not necessarily. But when you're transitioning to the cloud, everyone involved has to understand that cloud security is a shared responsibility between the cloud service provider and the customer, ultimately yourselves. As shown in this example, the cloud service provider, in this case, it's Amazon's shared security model, is typically securing the core infrastructure and the services as part of the shared responsibilities, but securing the operating system, the platforms, and the data ultimately remains your responsibility. And it's really key to remember these shared responsibilities and not believe that the cloud service provider is solely responsible for cloud security, because they're not. And if we, then we're certainly opening ourselves up more to an attack. Now, when we look at key threats is an interesting one. Cyber adversaries have long moved beyond network layers when kind of mapping out their attack vectors. And really, this slide shows some of the key threats that cloud environments are facing, whether it be range from distributed denial of service attacks, malware, ransomware, to credential-based attacks. But ultimately, the easiest way for an attacker to gain access to sensitive data is by compromising an end user's identity. This is still the easiest route in for them. And things get even worse, if that identity belongs to a privileged user who may have an even broader set of kind of access requirements and ultimately give the attacker the keys to the kingdom as such. The key thing here is that, an attacker is not going to traverse a network calling themselves HackerOne. They really are going to compromise an existing user's credentials so that they can transform and transition throughout the network going kind of undetected. Now, there are quite a few examples of this, and it's important to understand that it really only takes one credential. We can't get complacent and think that we are doing the minimum, to satisfy tick box from an audit point of view, because it only takes one compromised credential to impact millions, and that could be, millions of data records, millions of fines, millions of kind of intellectual property, go away. And a good example was an attack, relatively recently on one login, whereby an attacker obtained and used a highly sensitive key for the vendor's Amazon hosted cloud instance. And they retrieved that key from an intermediate host, effectively breaking into its service using a front door key. And it's one of many examples that you can find throughout the world that go on now that are all related to kind of cloud technologies and cloud environments. It really is essentially opening up multiple pathways into our critical data like we've never really seen before. Now, when it comes to breaches, all roads still lead to identity, right? Hackers don't hack in anymore. They log in using weak, default, stolen, or otherwise compromised credentials. And Forrester estimate that privileged credential abuse or misuse is at the heart of around 80% of breaches. But there's still so many organizations that have not started their privileged access management journey as yet. And if we look at this example of the attack life cycle, some people call it the kill chain, however you want to refer to it, there's really three main phases to this. First is to get inside the network. It's really the easy part, actually. There are far too many holes for us to protect, and we may be security professionals, we may have security budgets, and we may focus a lot of time, energy, resources. But the attackers got far more time than we have. They can sit there for days, weeks, months, years trying to probe and find a way in. And unfortunately, quite often they do, whether it be through humans or whether it be through technology. But it's easy for an attacker to go onto Google, to download all of these tool sets. And in fact, you don't have to be a hacker to do that. You could be anybody. So tools such as Metasploit, Mimikatz are freely available. Anyone can download and use them. So we have to have the mindset that they're on side in reality. And Zero Trust actually assumes this. It assumes that they are on the inside, and that's when our security kind of architecture really begins, and we have to kind of think differently. They're on the inside. They may move laterally around, so we call that the kind of fan-out phase, where they move in between machines, elevating credentials as they go, and then ultimately they want to exfiltrate data. Now, ultimately, our stance and our posture for this is that cloud has kind of changed things, right? We've gone from a world where 18, 19 years ago, privilege management was focused on bricks and mortar. It was focused on putting a vault in our data centers, protecting access to that. But as organizations have embraced cloud technology, then our attack surface has expanded. And there's a couple of things that you can do with privilege management tools that we'll have a look at coming up shortly, that kind of looks at, do we look to embrace new cloud technologies? Do we look at the native tool sets that these cloud providers have? Or do we look at a kind of lift and shift model of moving our cloud technologies into these platforms? Or do we look at kind of embracing new PAM technologies that were kind of more born in the cloud? So when we think about an attacker's viewpoint, now more than ever, we need to look at what our users have access to and how they have access to those systems. Our workers traditionally, in this model, access a data center, whether they be technical users or not. Traditionally, that's where all of our data is stored. If they're a privileged user, they will use protocols such as RDP, SSH, etc., to gain access via trusted paths. And as we've embraced new technology, new ways of working, we've now got remote workers coming in using trusted pathways into our data center as well. That on top of cloud, ultimately, all we've done is create more and more trusted pathways. And it's these trusted pathways that are critical for an attacker to traverse a network going undetected. So what can we do about this? And what are some of the new things that we must look out for in the privilege world due to looking at kind of cloud technologies? So next up, we're going to look at kind of a couple of key themes. One is, protecting access to the cloud, and the other is really protecting workloads within the cloud. And these are really two critical use cases when we embrace cloud technology. So the first one here is protecting access to the clouds. And what do we mean by this? Well, when you sign up to a cloud provider, you specify an email address, a password gets tied to your root user account, and then ultimately you'll go through a series of steps that help you protect that account. And the steps are quite interesting, right? There's some best practices associated with every cloud provider out there. And when you sign up for this root account, traditionally what it will do is allow you to apply MFA to it. And then along comes a password vault, and the password vault kind of says to you, hey, I want to protect that root account and I want to manage it for you. Well, it's a bit of a misconception to me in the privilege world, right? How can a vault log in and change AWS root if AWS is applying MFA? It can't. It simply can't, because the vault can't log onto it and apply the MFA code. So what traditionally happens is PAM vendors will kind of say to you, okay, we'll remove MFA from AWS because you've got MFA at the vault. And that, honestly, that scares the life out of me, because you're basically removing the lock from AWS. And yes, your vault may be able to manage AWS root, and it may have MFA associated with it, but you've now got no security on the front door. And that to me is absolutely crazy. So we're going to look at some interesting things here about how we do things a little bit different. Now, as well as protecting access to the cloud, whether it be root account credential management, federation for user logon, and the fact that we want to weaken our security. The other thing that we want to do is really protect workloads in the cloud. And the cloud by nature has a lot of ephemeral workloads. So by that, we essentially mean it's a little bit different to running a data center. In a data center, we know what resources we have. We buy servers, we rack them, we cable them, we install applications on them, and we should be able to tell you with a fairly accurate degree of accuracy how many servers we have. But in the world of kind of DevOps and infrastructure as code and things like that, nobody knows how many instances they have running in AWS, Azure, etc. Maybe the finance people do from a billing point of view. But the whole idea of the cloud is it's elastic and it grows and it shrinks. So there's some very different challenges associated with protecting these workloads in the cloud. And quite often traditional privileged access management controls don't really apply. We've got to think about, okay, how do we authenticate those workloads in the cloud? How are we protecting any credentials that those workloads may use or have? And how do we ensure that we're enforcing multi-factor authentication on them so that we're not leaving any weak points within the security kind of boundaries of those systems? So to look at these use cases a little bit more, the first thing that we need to think about is really how we protect access to the cloud. And the key problems that we have is, cloud management consoles. Think of, the Azure management console, the AWS GCP management consoles. They literally have full administrative control over all cloud infrastructure and services, right? And if we think about who's got access to those and who has access to those keys, we have seen some truly crazy situations where lots of different business units have had access to these root accounts. And I've never seen anything like it in my entire career. Sometimes, finance teams having AWS root and things like that. And you can understand it potentially from a billing point of view. But for me, it's giving somebody the keys to the data center and not having any security around. It's hard for me to get my head around. I'm very much used to access control in data centers and turning up, and you've got a swipe card key to get in. You have to sign all these books. Somebody will escort you to your rack, make sure you're on the right server and things like that. And now in a cloud, once you can access a data center with a username and password, that's scary from a security perspective. So we've got to look at how we protect access to those. The other thing is, the tools that our staff are using now to access cloud environments. So the whole concept of, DevOps, DevSecOps, DevOps, etc. It's a bit of a mouthful. But essentially now, what used to be infrastructure or, server support people or engineering, server engineers, that's really transitioned into the term of DevOps. And really, this is a bunch of super clever people that are now building things using code. Whereas, in the olden days, we used to buy a server, provision it, patch it, deploy an application. That can be done in code now. And these extremely clever people that most organizations have now, they use various different tools, various different management consoles that ultimately have access to our cloud environment so that they can do all of these kind of things. I call it by wizardry, mainly because I don't understand half of it. But it's interesting to see. It's interesting to view the world as it is now and how agile people are in their use of kind of these tools and what they can do with them. So we need to look at securing the consoles, securing the kind of CI/CD pipelines that our DevOps people are using and the tools that they're using. So from a solution point of view, we need to ensure that we are at a start doing admin or root account kind of management. And this really goes down to vaulting credentials, rotating them, auditing all access, and applying MFA. And my serious word of caution here, some of you on this call may be customers of other vault vendors, of competitors of ours, and that's no problem. The vault has been seen as potentially a commodity market now. My best bit of advice to you is don't move that account out of the control of the cloud provider. don't move it under the full control of the vault, because I guarantee you will weaken the security of your cloud provider. I'm really proud of what our engineering team and our product management team have done in this area. We have a concept of assisted account management. So we'll store that account in our vault. We will actively reach out and change it. But we've built this really cool capability, via means of a browser extension, where we'll actually automate it, but stop for the MFA prompt. So we always need a user to help out during that change process. And I think it's a fantastic effort that they've done. I think it solves a major problem that we have. I think if we look at staff access, DevOps tooling and things like that, again, the common kind of controls that you would see here is always vaulting. Typically, your DevOps use cases would use federated access. So don't create local IAM users in these cloud providers. Let's use federation, and let's always audit access and changes. When it comes to workloads and infrastructure in the cloud, the key difference here is that, as new servers and containers are created, they really become the most granular security boundary for our business data. And we have to protect these. The issue that we have with cloud resources is, by nature, they are designed to be ephemeral. You can spin up an instance, and you can spin it down in a matter of minutes, hours, days, weeks. It's really not like buying a server and waiting 6 weeks for it to be delivered, another 2 weeks for it to be wrapped and cabled. And, luckily those days are gone. But I think the very ephemeral nature of the workloads that we have now is a cause for concern from a security point of view. So when we look at controls that we can apply to protect workloads and infrastructure in the cloud, the first thing that comes to mind is enrollment. And this is a really interesting concept in the world of privilege. So if we think about mobile device management for a second, right? If you join an organization, you have a mobile phone, one of the first things that you do is often enroll that within an MDM solution for that company. It will do a certificate exchange, it will trust your mobile device, you may have to install some software that puts a sandbox on your phone, but ultimately there'll be a central policy server that applies a policy to your mobile device. It protects it, it secures the data on it. And if your mobile device is stolen, your workplace can delete the contents of your phone, or at least the sandbox. Now, imagine doing that with servers. So in a cloud world, think about enrolling a machine in a platform, and think about then protecting that machine and that workload with the PAM platform. For me, it's something that I think we could have done in the early days of privilege. I'm not quite sure why people haven't thought of this concept of kind of MDM for servers before. We've always very much focused on the privileged element, and it's quite an interesting thing. But if we look at things that we could do, so look at enrollment. How do we enroll devices into our PAM platform, and how do we do it when they are ephemeral? How do we handle the kind of vaulting of admin credentials on ephemeral machines? How are we enabling just-in-time access to those machines? How are we handling MFA? And the final bit is around machine-to-machine authentication. So a couple of critical capabilities that we advise that organizations should look at here. And some of the more interesting things for me are how app-to-app kind of communication happens. A lot of machines in the cloud are used for kind of applications. So you'll generally find machines talking to machines, applications talking to applications. And, in a typical old data center architecture, you'd have a kind of web layer, presentation layer talking to kind of database storage, etc. And this is no different with the cloud. It's just often service talking to another service. And we have to look at how we secure these communications. One of the big things that I've seen kind of change in the last kind of 6 months, I would say, in the cloud world, is that we're starting to see technologies leverage machine-to-machine authentication, rather than AAPM type use cases. And by that we mean application-to-application password management. So scripts, applications, making a call to a vault, using a username, password, API key to retrieve credentials for that script. For me, we look at that problem and I scratch my head when I look at it, because I think, okay, I've got an application that needs a credential, so it makes sense to store that credential in a vault. But in order to allow the application to retrieve it, I'm putting a line of code in that application that has a username, password, and API key. So I've just created a side door into my vault. And I'm doing that for every application that I've got. And that kind of is a little bit backwards in methodology. So, the rise of machines protecting themselves and machine authentication to communicate with the vault has been one of the great transitions that we've really seen in this kind of cloud journey over the past 6 months. So if we look at what is Cloud PAM, what's the big differences? What have we seen from a transition point of view? Over the last 19 years that PAM has really been a kind of technology stack. So for me, when I think about Cloud PAM, the first thing that I think of is a service. The solution must be available as a service. It must offer, subscription-based licensing rather than the old kind of model of perpetual. It must be available to communicate with my on-premise environment, with my multi-cloud strategy. And I shouldn't need to, manage it. I shouldn't need to patch it. I shouldn't need to worry about updating it or the maintenance of it. And obviously we all want the high nines availability, 99.9 at least. Often 4 nines, sometimes 5 nines that people want from an availability standpoint. You also want it to be hyper scalable. What do we mean by that? Well, this needs to grow as you do. Ultimately, it's a PAM vendor's responsibility to shoulder that infrastructure burden, the cost of it, etc. But you want to ensure that as you grow and as your use cases grow, that the PAM solution is going to grow with you and doesn't contain any bottlenecks. You may want it to be multi-tenanted. You may think that, you're subject to kind of making acquisitions and things like that. And you may want to have a central management console that have separate subtenants out under it. And then when we look at what do I need to install, what is it I need? What's my footprint? The key thing is to not really have a footprint. If you're using a SaaS service for a privileged access management solution, the last thing that you want to be doing is having physical servers on-prem, or lots of components to enable secure communications. You also don't want particularly inbound firewall ports and things like that. So what you'll see with a lot of SaaS PAM solutions now, especially the platform plays, the vault plays, you'll have the concept of a connector. Connectors are very lightweight in nature, and we see different things from different vendors. Some need dedicated hardware, some use terminal servers, some have different connectors for Windows to what they do for SSH, for instance, and some bundle a whole bunch of capabilities into a single lightweight connector. So have a look at them, have a look at their capabilities, but things to me to look out for. You want them lightweight, you want them speaking outwards out of your environment, and you want them to be the only thing that you have to install within your environment. So if we look at the different types of Cloud PAM solutions, because there really are different types, and the whole idea of this session is to really be kind of a bit more educational and tell you some of the key things to watch out for, as maybe you're embracing cloud technologies as you're going on this journey. What are the key considerations and key things to watch out for? So when organizations embrace cloud technologies, what we saw over the last kind of 5, 6 years is first and foremost the lift and shift model. And I think a lot of organizations did this in the early days of cloud technologies. We looked at it and thought, can I move my data center into the cloud? And we pretty much replicated the setup. As we did this, we kind of realized that, hold on, I'm not really getting economies of scale. This is generally costing me more than what my data center did itself. And we see a similar approach with PAM tools, right? We see some organizations that move their existing PAM tools to the cloud. And it's been an interesting journey, I think. Certainly a lot of the conversations we have, or a lot of the feedback that we gain is, by organizations kind of saying that they've really increased the number of resources required to support their PAM technologies. It's not been a simple transition mainly because of actually the different types of architecture that you get within cloud platforms. Typically, you have the concept of, let's say, VPC, virtual private cloud. You could design it like a subnet. You could design it like a mini data center. But typically, you would need to put the components for a PAM tool in each of these distributed VPCs. So you could turn a situation where you have, 10 servers supporting an on-prem deployment for your PAM tool quite easily into 40 or 50 servers when you embrace cloud technology, very easily. So generally, as a rule of thumb, organizations tend to grow rather than shrink their infrastructure footprint when they do the lift and shift model. And that really doesn't work for the cloud, because that ultimately means you're really paying the price of it. So the next kind of model is really the cloud native model. And by cloud native, when you sign on to a particular cloud platform, each cloud platform now has a series of tools. And actually, they're really good tools. I'm not going to say anything bad about them. Whether you look at all the major kind of public cloud providers, whether it be Azure, GCP, AWS, each one has an element of privilege management, and each one is trying to address security risks associated with users having privilege, whether they're doing something with ephemeral certificates, whether kind of secrets vault capabilities, whether they're purely doing kind of directory sync data, etc. And the cloud native approach is an interesting one. I think a lot of organizations certainly start here, and I don't think that's the wrong thing to do. Certainly the conversations that we have with organizations who try this, some of the key challenges they have is the fact that, they've got separate and distributed systems for vaulting. They may have an on-premise password vault solution, enterprise password vault. They may then adopt, a secrets management solution in each of their cloud providers. And all of a sudden you could have 4 different password vaults in play, 4 different management consoles managed by different teams with different security standards. And you can soon see how this leads to kind of identity sprawl. And generally, a security person or compliance person's nightmare, because now you've got no visibility over where, these privileges are kind of managed, how they're handled. As well as that, usually enterprise directory access is a big thing. And this is mainly due to how organizations adopt cloud technology rather than the fact that they are adopting it. So when we embrace cloud technologies, we look at who has access to it and what can they do. And traditionally, it could be infrastructure people, it could be DevOps people, they may be the same teams, but it's very rarely security teams that have access to these platforms and really look at security of them. They may mandate certain controls that must be in place. They may perform audit, compliance checks and things like that. But it's very rare they will be hands-on and kind of configuring things. So we're unsure as to how authentication, authorization and things like that are managed. It's quite often not our directory accounts that we're logging onto cloud resources with. It's quite often that VPNs are required for access into these resources. And there's a whole bunch of concerns that people have ultimately. The kind of third approach is really PAM as a service, using a SaaS-based PAM solution. And usually, a modern PAM as a service kind of solution would offer a centralized password kind of vaulting solution or platform to really tie in multi-cloud environments and on-prem. You'd have a centralized kind of secrets management platform, service account management platform. And really, the key is consolidation, right? We all want a single interface. As much as we hate the term single pane of glass, it really applies in this model, right? Because we've got multiple, let's call them data centers, multiple providers of those data centers, and we want one single tool to sit in the middle and to be able to communicate with all of them and to be able to kind of manage them all as one. Now, there are some gotchas, right? There's never a quick and easy way of doing something, and there's always pros and cons to everything we do in life. So what are the key gotchas with these kind of models? So we'll look at the lift and shift approach, we'll look at the cloud native and the PAM as a service approach, and we'll kind of see what are the key gotchas with each of these. So if we look at the lift and shift, the expansion approach, so moving our PAM tools into the cloud ourselves and maintaining an on-prem premise. The key thing really is each VPC, each site, each provider will ultimately need these capabilities installed within them. So traditionally what we'd have is a whole bunch of in our on-prem environment, and we'd have to then install these components in our cloud. Because of the way that we architect our cloud solutions, and we have, virtual private cloud, virtual private networks, virtual private data centers, whatever you want to call them, we have multiple sites where we need these components. If we don't, what we'll end up with is firewalls like Swiss cheese and communications kind of going a bit kind of crazy and wild. So when we look at the drawbacks of lifting and shifting our existing on-prem technologies into the cloud, the things to look out for is how many servers are you actually going to be required to have in your cloud environments. It's certainly not going to be one, it's certainly not going to be two. So you need to look at how many you're going to be required to have. How much is that going to cost you? Cost is really the critical thing. If it costs more than running your data center yourself, you're not really using cloud in the right way. Look at the suitability. Most on-premise solutions are really retrofitted to support good use cases. They're not cloud native. Be cautious of that, because if you're using, basic things, a session proxy in the cloud, for instance, if you look at the resource requirements to run that, if you look at whether it needs terminal server licenses, all of these things add up from a cost point of view. So be aware of them. Also look at whether you need VPNs. If you need VPNs, any form of directory sync, again, in a modern kind of fashion, in a modern PAM stack, all these things can be avoided now. So try not to go down that path. From a support point of view, as yourself as an organization, how do you support the exponential growth of these solutions in the cloud? All of a sudden you've got a lot more infrastructure to support, and look at then how you update and maintain the solution. It's not easy to manage servers these days, and certainly a lot of organizations are trying to move away from that model. If we look at the cloud native approach, cloud native is by far the biggest thing that I think we see now. Organizations that try and do a little bit with the native capabilities that public cloud providers have internally. And, the feedback that we gain on that is that people tend to see an identity silo kind of crisis happen, where, we've got an on-prem directory system, traditionally Active Directory. You've then got, AWS that has IAM users. You may then have some Azure AD. And it's really, how do you tie all of these things together? If you're using GCP, you may have Google Directory in there as well. So avoiding kind of identity silos is critical. But the approach to native cloud, does tend to see the creation of identity silos, the duplication of Active Directory into these kind of cloud platforms. Sometimes you'll see site-to-site VPNs being required, and ultimately leveraging the free infrastructure as a provider PAM capabilities. And sometimes they're good enough. So I'm not going to say they're not. It really comes down to the controls that you need to have in place, how you want to manage it. Some of the biggest drawbacks we perceive in this is really a cost point of view. Yes, the tools themselves are free, but ultimately they require headcount cost, and that's quite often prohibitive. It's a very different skill set managing AWS resources than what it is PAM tool. PAM tools traditionally you fold into either the IAM team or the security team for management. AWS needs some specialist skills a lot of the time to get things configured the right way, as does Azure, GCP, and any other cloud provider. Site-to-site VPNs within cloud tools are often really not affordable. Can be cost prohibitive. From a maintenance point of view, definite duplicate efforts required to set up across multiple kind of cloud VPCs, multiple SaaS providers, multiple kind of public cloud platforms. So just be aware of how much effort these things can be to set up, in a multi-cloud environment. There's often limited migration capabilities, so each public cloud provider would kind of be a siloed instance that you need to manage. That ultimately gives you lack of centralized management, which gives you lack of visibility and the potential for blind spots to occur. The final approach is really Cloud PAM as a service. I think looking at the leaders quadrant across the PAM space, every vendor in that leaders quadrant now has a SaaS capability across their PAM stack. And I really think, the world of PAM is shifting to SaaS. And there's many reasons why that is a good thing. Certainly cost, it's the least expensive approach from a resource and headcount perspective. But the biggest thing by far is maintenance. We've seen some very big infrastructure footprint deployments of PAM tools over the last kind of 18 or so years. Simply the volume of servers required to support PAM technologies is huge. The management, the upgrading of them, things like that, it can become a nightmare for a lot of organizations. So to go with a SaaS provider that gives you a multi-tenanted solution, maintains the solution for you and all of the underlying infrastructure, does all of the upgrades and things like that. And the fact that these solutions are globally scalable, you'll often find these SaaS solutions built on whether it be Azure, GCP, AWS. It makes no difference where these tools are even hosted anymore. What matters is, can they manage my multi-cloud kind of environment? When I think about security, for a PAM vendor, security is our business. It's our job to make sure that these environments are secure. So for us taking that headache, away from you, and us then taking the burden on ensuring these solutions are secure, it really, if I was on the customer side still, it would give me happy ears that I didn't have to worry kind of about that thing anymore. So to wrap up on a couple of things here before we look at Q&A, from a maturity model point of view, privilege hasn't changed, in terms of its maturity model over the last kind of 18 years that I've seen. The key elements have always been going after the quick wins, and the quick wins, always start with vaulting. Vaulting enables you to randomize all of the passwords that are generally always the same on every single server out there, and get rid of those kind of shared accounts and control access to them. So vaulting is critical to any PAM program. I can honestly say, I've worked in the privilege space obviously for 19 years now, and something strange happens every time I speak to somebody involved in PAM programs. And one of the interesting things is how many organizations fail to get past vaulting. And I really see this as a critical thing, right? And I think vaults are often misused. And I think that leads to a problem, especially when it comes to users and their privileged accounts. I don't think vaulting is the right approach for those accounts. And we'll cover that on a future kind of webinar that we do. But really the key thing for me in PAM is this point here: identity consolidation and least privilege, least access, privileged least access. So when we think about identity consolidation, right, one of the goals of privilege, reduce the number of privileged accounts in my estate. If you don't perform identity consolidation, how do you reduce the number of accounts? You can't just go and delete them because obviously they're in use, they're used for something. When you think about risk reduction, well, it's really least privilege that enables you to reduce risk. You're reducing privilege from somebody's kind of account. But quite often, organizations don't get to this second point here, and that's because they get too hung up on vaulting and too hung up on getting stuck at various stages within vaulting projects. For me, this point 2 here is the absolute critical one for risk reduction when it comes to privilege management. Point 3 is really, the final hardening. And to be honest with you, it's very rare that organizations actually get to this endpoint. I think it's blue sky goal that I think we absolutely need to have. I think it's something that certain regulated environments need to do and need to have. But I don't think it's needed for the majority of people. So I think if we can cope with kind of the vaulting and the identity consolidation piece, that's really key for us in moving forward from a security risk point of view. One of the other things that we often hear is really the confusion in the market around privilege tools, and I think we as a vendor space, right, we have caused a lot of confusion in the market with acronyms, different names for things, and it's a little bit crazy, to sometimes navigate the world of privilege. It doesn't help that analysts often call things by different names as well. So there is some confusion there, but some of the big acronyms that you're likely to see is starting with PAM itself. What does PAM mean? Well, privileged access management. People often forget that it's access management. It's not account management. It's not just about privileged accounts. It's about access. How is that access used? When you talk about PIM, it's more about identity management, privileged identity management. Then you've got things like PAS, privileged account security, access security. Different vendors use it interchangeably. Then more into Gartner terms, PEDM, so privileged elevation delegation management. This is all about least privilege. PASM is your typical kind of vault and session proxy, so privileged account and session management. We've got terms such as PSM, so privileged session management. PXM could be privilege anything management. It's a little bit of a strange one. And then into the new world of terminology, PTA, so privileged task automation is something that I think this year in the PAM space we are going to see a lot of, and potentially even some consolidation across vendors with PTA tooling. But we are already starting to see a lot of integration use cases with tools such as UiPath from an automation point of view. PACA, privileged accounts or privileged access compliance auditing, privileged identity and access management, and then application management. There is a whole myriad of acronyms within this space. We still see some where we scratch our heads and think, I've got no idea what that means. And that will probably continue. But that's a quick glossary for you. And if you've got any more acronyms, just let us know. We're always happy to read more and to be able to educate people more. So with that being said, let's kind of end this from a presentation point of view. It is designed to be a one series. So this is more on the educational side. We do run more technical ones. But I really appreciate everybody's attendance, and we do have some questions in the Q&A box. So if you have some more, please feel free to write them in, and we'll go through this now. So one of the first questions that we have is really from Chris. So good morning. Have you considered biometric authentication, so voice, face, etc., to help alleviate the logon and password risk? Absolutely. We certainly do. And I guess I'll choose my words carefully here, because a lot of organizations promote biometrics without actually doing true biometrics. So I like the fact that you've put voice, face, etc. on there. So where we are at the moment from an integration point of view with MFA providers, we're a member of the FIDO2 Alliance, and we support kind of on-device biometrics, I'm going to call it, and that's because your lovely phone provider and things does the same. So yes, we can do whether it be fingerprint, whether it be, face unlock. But I do think we're going to see a lot more from biometric. There's some really cool kind of things happening in the market with biometrics, whether it be kind of deep vein analysis, whether it be voice analysis and things like that. So, yep, absolutely. And I think we will be tying that to more ephemeral type tokens for authentication in the market as well. So next up, I think it's Giridar, so apologies if I pronounced your name incorrectly there. So can we explain a bit more on MFA? Certainly, so multi-factor authentication. So traditionally, when you log into something, you've got a username and password. So that's something you know. And that something you know could often be static in nature. It could be the credential that multiple people know. It could be a credential that's been the same credential for so much time. So you kind of have what's called multi-factor authentication, where you combine this something that you know with something that you have. And that something that I have is a multi-factor authentication prompt push notification on my phone. It could be the old style kind of credit cards with a number on, but it's a secondary factor of authentication. And for me, I see a huge risk in cloud. When people sign up to cloud providers, you get a root account. That's the key to your data center, and it can be accessed with a username and password. Now, a best practice when you sign up to cloud providers is apply multi-factor authentication to that account. The public cloud providers often provide, those capabilities, or they'll tell you to use an authenticator app on your mobile device. But then when we look at how vaults work, vaults reach out to talk to a system, and they'll use a protocol or some web automation to reach out and to change a credential on that device. Now, they can't do that if there's MFA applied, because they don't have that something. They don't have that code. A PAM solution just has a credential, so it will try and log in using that credential, and it will try and rotate the password. So the advice that I've certainly seen in the market, and that we've been kind of told about by various kind of prospects and customers, is that PAM vendors are saying, okay, well, don't protect that account using MFA from the cloud provider, use it at our vault. And I just think that is crazy. It's one of the worst security decisions I think anyone could ever make, because you're taking that lock away from your data center. And all you've done is shift the account into a vault and removed all of the security from your front door. It doesn't make sense. So I think, as I mentioned, we've done a really smart job of providing a way around that, and a way to do it in a secure manner. So next up, what could be the downsides of using Cloud PAM as a service, going for a SaaS approach versus the other two approaches? That is a really good question, actually. And the biggest thing is actually mentality. And I think that's the biggest barrier we've really seen is, people are very much afraid because they're thinking, okay, we're going to put credentials in the cloud. And to be honest with you, as soon as you start using cloud providers, you've got credentials in the cloud. So don't think of a SaaS solution as you're moving your credentials from on-premise into the cloud. You're already doing that. Do people want to manage servers? Do they want to manage software? Do they want to manage upgrade processes, procedures? Nobody wants to do that anymore. I think the as a service model is all positive. That's not to say customers don't come to us and say, hey, we need this on-prem. There are definitely highly regulated areas and businesses that need to be on-premise. But that's kind of the biggest thing I would say. Okay, a question from Greg. So I think I heard you mention a browser extension requirement. So yeah, this is a capability that, Centrify had a while ago when we were in the IDaaS business. So we had this browser extension that could do form fill. And, when we look at cloud technologies now, if we look at, let's say, AWS Root as an example. So what we've done and what we've come up with this really neat way of managing Root within our Vault, rotating it, but the browser extension that we have, and it's in preview mode at the moment, so we are kind of betaing it internally and enabling it for certain customers. This browser extension that we have will ultimately do the logon to the AWS website. It will do all of the automation, and it will prompt the user within your business that you need the MFA code before it can go a step further with the AWS Root password management. But it's the browser extension that's doing all this work. And you could do this locally on your computer, or you could have it on a hosted browser if you wanted it to be more secure on something like a terminal server. Okay, next question from Greg. Does Centrify require a third-party tool for MFA enforcement? So Duo, or do we have our own tool available baked in? So we actually are an MFA provider. So we have our own MFA solution built into our platform, but we can also integrate with third parties as well. So we can do either. And, we can fit in if people use their own authenticator apps or biometrics on the mobile devices, we can use those. So how does decentralized identity, blockchain identity impact PAM solutions and implementation methods? This is one of my favorite kind of questions to answer. And it's definitely not going to have time in 4 minutes, but let's give it a go. So decentralized identity, blockchain identity, is going to be one of the biggest nightmares, but greatest saviors for security people moving forward. And, we have many conversations on this internally. And I think, personally, the way of decentralizing identity and decentralizing storage of things like credentials is going to be the future. Right now, where we are is very much in a centralized approach. I think we're starting to see with DevOps the move to a decentralized identity approach, but I don't think we're anywhere near its potential at the moment. I think it's going to be a major headache for security people. And I mainly think that's because it's going to take a lot for people to get their head around. But I've had some interesting conversations with people who work in the kind of blockchain world. And I think if we use that technology in the right way, I think there is a lot of potential in that area for privilege to kind of move beyond these ephemeral tokens where we are now. That's the next iteration of PAM, is using ephemeral tokens for access. But I think we can potentially move to more of a blockchain method for verification of identity and using kind of almost the distributed ledger model to prove an application is who it says it is. And I think its value is going to be in application communications or service-to-service communications rather than humans. So next question from Jimmy. The market is moving towards digital identity. How can biometrics be used for authentication and the identity information be stored in vaults? Absolutely. So whilst the market is, a lot of infrastructure, a lot of code, a lot of applications still isn't. So definitely there is a move to digital identity. It kind of ties into the last question that we had on blockchain and the future and the evolution of privilege, the evolution of identity, the evolution of authentication. The world of vaults, right? I can definitely see a world where the vault shrinks, the vault becomes decentralized in its nature. But I always think we're going to have vaults. We're always going to have some form of credential somewhere. And that could be a token. It could be a temporary or ephemeral token in its nature. It could be a token that's split across a blockchain that multiple kind of ledgers are verifying. But we're always going to need some form of platform for management of this. So I think your question is extremely valid. I think it's completely relevant. I just don't think we're quite there yet, but I definitely think they're the questions we need to answer and we need to provide answers to. So I think we're just kind of at the top of the hour there. So I just wanted to thank you all for your time today, and really thanks for all of the great questions. Hopefully we answered them all, but if there are any outstanding, we'll be sure to get back to you in writing on those with our answers. And would like, if you need to follow up with us, please do feel free to contact us as well. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your days.